in 3, in 2, in 1. Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Timothy here, going into part 2 of my review for Hour of Devastation. I already reviewed the white cards, so be sure to check that video out. And here we're going to review the blue cards. Probably make this video a little shorter than the last one. I am working on trying to condense my videos, but I didn't really want to read off a script for these. I wanted to go ahead and just voice my opinion as it came to me. Keep in mind that release weekend is tomorrow, and the set is available to draft online, so if you want to get some play tested in, go ahead and do so, and that these are strictly my opinions, so if you agree or disagree, that's perfectly fine. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think I'm overvaluing or undervaluing, and we can have a discussion about it. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and jump on in, and we are going to skip past all of the rating scale this time. I will be using the rating scale, but if you're interested in a breakdown of all of the scores and stuff, just go ahead back to the white video and watch that. All you really need to know is it's on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being bad cards, 10 being your best cards, right? And unlike white, we do have a card here that I consider completely unplayable, or at least I would caution against trying to make it work, even though it is a really sweet effect, just not one you want for limited. That card is Swarm Intelligence, the Locust God, destroying your day. So for 6 and a blue, you get a rare enchantment that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you may copy that spell and choose new targets for the copy. There are a lot of things wrong with this. First off, it doesn't do anything the turn it comes down. It's 7 mana. It's going to eat up a whole turn. If you even get to 7 mana on curve, and then you also still have to have spells to cast after it. Obviously, this is like here for the blue-red spell deck, and you know you could put this in your deck, and it might copy some spells, but you're probably going to die before it gets going, or you're just going to have enough spells that you don't even need to be copying spells to win. Don't play this card. It's just really bad. Leave it for your busted EDH decks. Sideboard cards, all of the colors are going to have a sideboard card, at least one, due to the defeat cycle, and we're going to see a couple blue sideboard cards here. The one I want to talk about mostly is Jace's Defeat. This is 1 in a blue for an uncommon instant. Counter target blue spell if it was a Jace Planeswalker Scry 2. Keep in mind there are no Jaces in this block, so don't worry about that. This is basically just Gainsay. In fact, it's exactly Gainsay. I guess it's strictly better, quote-unquote, but you won't even play Gainsay that often. Gainsay was in Theros, which had a similar block, or a similar cycle of cards that hated on their own color, but it's so rare that you end up in a situation where A, you have this card, B, you're playing this color, and C, you also get matched up against the color. You know, you might play one mirror match on average in a given draft, like a 3-round draft, where having access to this effect is good. And yeah, if I'm playing against blue, I'm going to board Jace's Defeat in, but it's only going to be like, you know, when you board this in, it's going to be like a 7 or 8. It's not going to be like a bomb sideboard card or anything like that. One thing to note here about Jace's Defeat, it's one of the worst because it doesn't deal with permanents that have already resolved, whereas something like Gideon's Defeat or Chandra's and Liliana's, as we'll see, can deal with permanents on the battlefield. This only counters a spell, so it might be late to the party if you draw it later in the game. All right, moving away from our sideboard cards, started getting into cards that we're going to be drafting and might actually be playing. Remember that 2s are cards that I don't want in the average deck. They're very specific cards that they're usually really, really bad, but in the right kind of decks, they have some sort of function. The first I want to talk about is our run-of-the-mill, no pun intended, mill card, Fraying Sanity, 2 in a blue for a rare curse. The enchanted player, and at the beginning of each end step, that's yours and your opponent's end step, the enchanted player puts the top X cards of their library into the graveyard, where X is the number of cards already put into the graveyard from anywhere that this turn. And notice it says that graveyard. So the way this works is if they're cursed and your opponent gets 5 cards into the graveyard during that turn, at the end step, they'll put another 5 cards into the graveyard. Now, the problem here is that you already have to be milling for this to do anything. When a creature dies, yes, it goes to the graveyard and they'll mill 1, or whenever they cast a spell, like an instant or sorcery, it'll probably go to the graveyard and they'll mill 1 on the end step. But you need to be a dedicated mill deck to make this work. And the reason I give this a 2 instead of a 0 is because I think you can build a dedicated mill deck If you start off with this in a draft, you could really make it work. And this is not a card other people are going to be interested in. So it's really feasible to think that maybe you get 2 copies of this in your deck if you want it. Like literally nobody else is going to take this card. Nobody wants this in their combat-oriented deck. So if you want to build the mill deck and you start off with this, you might be able to make it work. There are a couple mill cards, but they're not very good. So you need to get them all together. And one real big problem is if you build around this and you don't specifically draw this card, the rest of the cards you draw are going to be really bad. Think of cards like Compel an Argument, which mill 5, or we'll see a couple other mill cards here in a second. They don't do as much on their own. You're just not going to win by casting Compel an Arguments that often if that's the only thing you're doing. So you need to have the Fray Insanity and then your mill cards. That can just go completely wrong. I suggest not playing this, but if you want to try to make it work, go ahead. And I imagine I'll lose to this at least once in this format. Next 2 on our list here is another mill card, which goes hand in hand with the last one, Seer of the Last Tomorrow. What a name. 2 and a blue for a 1/4 common Naga cleric. I didn't even realize this was a Naga until I saw the art up close. It looked like a human from the spoilers. But anyway, you pay a blue, you tap it, and you discard a card. Target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Now, I just assumed this milled 4 the first time, and then I played 2-Headed Giant, and someone's like, no, it's 3. This is terrible. Even in a mill deck, mill 3 is not good. Mill 3 is not a lot. And the problem with this is that you have to discard a card to activate the ability and use mana and tap it. Why are there so many costs associated with this? This could have just been blue, tap, target player mills 3, and it would have been like an uncommon that you still wouldn't play. As is, a 1/4 for 3 is just a terrible card in this format. It's going to get crushed, and discarding a card is not what you want to do to make your mill plan work. If you have Fray Insanity, then this is the type of card that you start moving in on, but I don't think other people are interested in this, so you should be able to pick it up pretty late. And I don't suggest using it for like a self-mill plan either, even though that is something you can do since blue has a lot of embalm and such. Another 2 on the list here, Proven Combatant. I'm just not a fan of this card. Some people like it, I don't. It's 1 blue for a 1/1 common human warrior, and it has Eternalize for 4 and double blue. So 1 mana 1/1 that comes back as a 6 mana 4/4. No abilities, anything like that. The card's weird. The most interesting thing to me is how does a 1 mana 1/1 prove itself to Bolas and reach the ranks of like his Profound Army or anything like that? I don't understand the flavor of the card. Like as a 1 mana 1/1, it sounds way more badass than it really is. This card's bad. I said the same thing with Steadfast Sentinel, and I'll say it again. If your goal is to eternalize this, and that's really what you're aiming at, then putting this card in your deck is a liability to get to that point. You don't want a 1 mana 1/1 in your deck. I don't care what kind of payoff you get for it later. And a 6 mana 4/4 is just not a card you're excited to play either. Yes, you get 2 cards out of this, but neither of those cards are good, and they don't add up to something I want in my deck. There are blue aggro decks in this format. We'll see a lot of cards that have shifted towards aggro when it comes to blue. This is a card that I completely recommend leaving out of your deck. Moving on to our 3s. These are cards that I'll put in my deck, but I'm not happy about it. They're cards that will fill the 22nd, 23rd slot if I don't find better replacements. The first one is Cunning Survivor. 1 in a blue for a 1/3 common human warrior. Whenever you cycle or discard a card, Cunning Survivor gets +1/+0 until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. The most important part there is that it can't be blocked when you cycle, meaning that this can chip in for a little bit of damage over a couple turns if you're able to consistently cycle and discard. My problem, and the reason I put it at a 3, is that if you're not constantly cycling or discarding, then this just isn't that good. Also, I don't think you should be cycling and discarding on your turn, since it just gives your opponents more options if you're tapping out most of your mana on your own turn just to start swinging with things like this. And I don't think you want to be cycling over and over again. Now, if you're the Drakehaven deck or something like that, and you have a huge payoff for cycling over and over, then sure, Cunning Survivor is a card I like in there. But as far as like blue aggro decks go, I'm not a big fan, and it doesn't even block exceptionally well. 1/3 will do a decent job for a turn or 2, but it falls off a good bit. It is unblockable damage, which is nice and gives you some late game inevitability, but it doesn't hit very hard, and I'm not a huge fan of the card overall. Avon Reed Stalker. Stalking Reed since 2017. 3 and a blue for a 2/3 common bird warrior with Flash and Fly-In. This is weird. If the stats were flopped and this was a 3-2, switched, maybe not flopped, flip-flopped, and this was a 3-2 instead of a 2-3, I would like the card a lot more. In fact, we've seen that before, Cloaked Siren. This I don't like as much. A 2-power flyer for 4 is not what I'm looking for, and this doesn't block exceptionally well either. I do like that it can ambush some things, and it plays well with counter spells and bounce spells, but it's a card that I'm not super excited about. It may actually be upwards like a 5-ish, just an average card that you'll put in most decks, or at least you'll play it a good percentage of the time, but it's not a card I'm actively looking for. It's the type of card that if I'm blue and I'm scrapping for blue playables, I'll pick it up and play it. Another weak filler card here, Hour of Eternity. I always hate seeing cool rares like this really low in the list, but I'm skeptical about it. It's double X and triple blue. So blue, 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 XX is the cost here. It's a rare sorcery, and it says exile X target creatures from your graveyard. For each card exiled this way, create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 4/4 black zombie. So basically, you eternalize X creatures from your own graveyard and make copies of them, right? 4/4s instead of their normal base power and toughness. This means you have to pay X twice for each single target, right? On its base, you're paying 5 mana to get a single creature back, 7 mana to get 2, 9 mana to get 3, so on and so forth. You're not going to get up to 9 or 11 mana too often on this, even though when it does happen, this will be just an absolute bomb nightmare card for your opponent. I just think there are a lot of times this won't pan off the way you want it to. First off, it's triple blue. Second off, 5 mana to reanimate a 4/4 from your graveyard is not amazing. This card could be even lower, but you would play a 5 mana 4/4 sometimes if you, in the right kind of deck. Not often, but in the right kind of deck, if it had a good ability, you would play it. At 5 mana, this is basically a lot Rise from the Grave, and a bad version of that. It's harder to cast, it doesn't target creatures in your opponent's graveyard, and it's just so clunky and weird for a blue deck. Plus, you have to have a good army of creatures already in your graveyard. There are other effects that do this very similar thing that we'll see much, much later in my review. So I think you could get a better version of this card. But as is, I'm not a huge fan of Hour of Eternity. It has too much setup going for it, even though I acknowledge that there are some decks where it might play out very, very well. Moving on to our forwards. Remember that forwards are archetypal cards. Cards that in the average deck aren't very good, but in a specific kind of deck, the rating will go up. The first one I want to mention is Riddle Form, a card that I actually think is pretty good here. It's 1 in a blue for an uncommon enchantment. When you cast a non-creature spell, you may have Riddle Form become a 3/3 Sphinx with fly-in addition to its other types until end of turn. You can also pay 2 in a blue to scry 1. So Riddle Form is really nice here if you have a very, very heavy spell-based deck. It turns into a 3/3 every time you cast a spell, and you only pay 2 mana for it up front. So a 2 mana 3/3 flyer, nobody's really arguing that that's a good card. The problem is you have to be very aggressive, and you have to have a lot of spells to keep this going. Playing defense with this isn't the best thing, even though it's a nice deterrent to keep your opponent from attacking. I really love that they put the mana sink on here. A lot of people might see that and think, well, that's just way too much to be scrying, but having a mana sink like that is fantastic, and scrying and being able to activate a scry ability turn after turn if you get to the late game can really, really pull you ahead. I like Riddle Form. I really like that it has kind of a backup plan to the original plan, which is to attack with a 3/3, and if that doesn't work, you have this mana sink attached to it. It's just, it only fits in specific kind of decks. If you're playing like 17, 18 creature deck, then you don't want Riddle Form in the first place. But if you're playing 9, 10 creatures and you have a really high spell base, like your average red-blue decks, then I think you'll be pretty happy with Riddle Form. Next up on the archetypal list is Vizier of the Anointed. And don't be fooled by the grade. This card's probably better than a 4. You just have to have a deck to support it. Vizier of the Anointed is 3 and a blue for a 2/4 uncommon human cleric with a really weird picture. When he enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an Eternalize or Embalm creature and put it in the graveyard. And when you activate an Eternalize or Embalm ability, draw a card. So a cool little build-around card here if you have the cards to go with it, right? If I'm running one other Embalm creature in my deck, I'm probably not playing this since it's a 4 mana 2/4. Those aren't great stats, see Giant Spider and the like. But if I have 3, maybe even 2, I think would be my minimum. If I have 2 plus internalize or embalm creatures, I think I'm pretty happy to play this. The fact that this gets to fetch one up and throw it in the graveyard is almost like drawing a card already, since it gives you access to a creature out of your graveyard. But actually drawing a card whenever you activate one of those abilities is pretty sweet, and a huge incentive to pick up some embalm creatures in the Amonkhet pack if you can get them. Another archetype or filler card. I've heard a lot of people say this card's really good, and I don't quite know yet. I'll have to see it in action. The card is Imaginary Threats. 2 and double blue for an uncommon instant. Creatures target opponent controls attack this turn if able. During that player's next untap step, creatures he or she controls don't untap. You can also cycle it for 2 mana. So very, very situational card. The problem with it is that it's blue, and there has to be a situation that you can engineer where you have creatures on board that possibly swing for lethal. You don't have to block with them. You're not in a position where you're taking lethal from your opponent if you force them to attack. There are a lot of things that have to go right to make this work. Thankfully, it has cycling, which really mitigates the risk of this just not working, which is a hallmark sign of a good cycler card. I would probably include this in most of my blue decks, but again, if I'm running, red blue and my primary win conditions are super powered flyers and I'm just looking to dirtle the ground, this is not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in imaginary threats when I'm playing something like blue green and we're in a board stall with a bunch of green creatures and I can use this to eat a bunch of theirs. The cool thing here is that it basically gives you 2 turns to do whatever you want to your opponent, since their creatures don't untap the following turn either. You can use this defensively if you really need to, although it won't pan out that well. You want to use this to finish the game, so it is kind of a win condition, but the board needs to be right and things need to be going your way. Almost a win more card, but not quite. I think it's good. I'll have to see it pan out. Moving on to our filler cards, our 5s, cards that I'm okay playing. Give them the thumbs up. 1 thumb up, not too many. The first one, and I think this one's going to be in a little bit of contention, Eternal of Harsh Truths. 2 and a blue for a 1/3 uncommon zombie cleric with Afflict 2, and whenever it attacks and isn't blocked, draw a card. So one thing to note here, I think this is our first Afflict creature. Whenever you block an Afflict creature, you take that amount of damage, or you lose that amount of life. It is life loss, not damage, but I think this card is a lot worse than it looks just because it's a 1/3. Like, I'm happy if my opponent attacks this into my 2/3 or not my 2/3, but like a 3/3. Even if they're holding up a trick, I'm happy to block and take my 2 rather than let them draw a card. It's not really dealing that much damage, and if they're using a trick and wasting their turn trying to bounce my creature, just draw a different card, then whatever. It reminds me a lot of Watchful Naga, which is a card I like. I'm not saying that Eternal is bad here. I'm just saying it requires a little bit of setup. Watchful Naga, it needs to have a clear attack, and it draws you a card no matter what. Eternal of Harsh Truths isn't even going to do that most of the time. You really want to draw a card before you're happy playing this. Just a 1/3 for 3 with Afflict 2 is not great in my opinion. I just don't see that being a card that I'm happy to play. But if I know I can get this creature in there, then, it's cool. One thing to note here is that the creature doesn't actually have to deal combat damage. So if your opponent puts a -1/-1 counter onto the Eternal, you can still attack. And if they don't block, you still get to draw cards, which is pretty nice that your 0-power creature can do that. But if you have anything, I don't know, Cartouche of Knowledge, something to give this flying or make it unblockable, it gets a lot better. Without that, I don't think it's that good. Next one, Strategic Planning, Rock, Paper, Scissors. 1 in a blue for a sorcery at common. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand, the rest in your graveyard. Not a bad card. I don't think I'd ever be disappointed to play this card on turn 2 unless my opponent was just completely beating my face in. But it's a fine little filter card. It digs 3 cards deep. It's nice. Gives you a card right away. If you're looking for lands, this is sweet. If you're splashing, this gets you closer to your splash. If you have graveyard synergies, it does dump the extra 2 cards in the graveyard, which is nice. You can set up some Embalm or Eternalize or what have you. Maybe even some Aftermath synergies. I think this card's fine. I think I'd run at least 1 copy. Probably not too many more than that, even though certain cards like Enigma Drake and Warfire Javelineer get a lot better when you have more spells. So I'd be willing to run more than 1 in those decks. But as is, I think 1's a fine addition to most blue decks. Another average card here, we've got Countervailing Winds. I value this about as much as I would any 3-mana counter spell. It's 2 in a blue for a common instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each card in your graveyard. You can also cycle this for 2 mana. I think this is fine. It's not good in the early game. It gets a lot better in the late game, whereas something like Cancel or Reduce is better in the early game but drops off a little bit in the late game. Well, Cancel is just fine at most points. And I actually like Cancel in this format. I think just being able to keep tempo with these blue decks and having counter spells for your opponent's play is good if you can't pick up premium removal. I don't know too much about Countervail and Winds, but I do like that it has Cycling. This is basically just a worse version of Censor, since Censor cycles cheaper and it's better earlier in the game, but I can see this doing some work, and I think I'd be fine playing 1 in most of my decks. From there, we're going to talk about Spellweaver Eternal, which is basically a reprinted version of Umara Tangler from Oath of the Gatewatch, just a 2/1 prowess for 2 mana, except you get the bonus of Afflict 2 here. This is what I'm talking about when I'm saying that blue is shifted towards being a little bit more aggressive. A 2-power prowess creature for 2 mana is a card that you want to be attacking with frequently, and Afflict 2 is a nice little bonus on there. Again, it's a zombie too. That's not going to come up too often in blue decks, but hey, it might. If you have blue-white, zombie paramount, I don't know. It might come up. But anyway, 2 mana, 2-power prowess creature is fine for most decks. I wouldn't take too many of these unless I'm trying to beat down. Amara Entangler was pretty good and beat down blue-red decks when it came to that format. And I imagine if you're some sort of blue-red beatdown deck or blue-white beatdown deck with Spellweaver Eternals, you could do worse than this card. Lots of filler to talk about here. Tragic Lesson, the most brutal art in this set by far. 2 and a blue. For an instant at common, draw 2 cards, and then discard a card unless you return a land you control to its owner's hands. Basically, this is Catalog from Shadows over Innistrad, even though I believe that's a reprint from a different set. Draw 2 cards, discard a card. That's a card I'm fine playing. I think you'll play at least 1, even though you don't want to go overboard on this type of effect. It is worth noting that the more cyclers you have in your deck, the less you want just straight up card draw anyway, since you have a pretty decent chance of just filtering to what you need anyway. But I think Tragic Lesson's fine enough that you'll play it. I don't think you'll be returning a land to your hand too often, even though that gives you a nice little out to draw in this late in the game where you don't have to discard a card. And being able to bounce, I don't know, a desert that cycles or something seems interesting. I don't think this card's a premium draw spell. I don't think it's a terrible draw spell either, and I'm happy playing 1 in most of my blue decks. All right, really bumping up our game now. Moving on from the average filler to low priority playables. Remember that 6s are cards that I really want to have in my deck, but I'm not taking them second, third pick. I'm waiting till later in the pack or hoping they'll wheel. First one is Striped Riverwinder. I think this card looks terrible. I know a lot of people love the art, but I don't know. It looks like something out of Archer, or it looks like I could peel a sticker off of it. But anyway, enough about the art. 6 and a blue for a 5/5 common serpent with Hexproof and Cyclone Blue. Hexproof is just my straight up favorite ability to have on a creature for limited. It makes that creature uninteractable. You're not going to kill it. There are some edict effects, but you got to be in a really weird situation for that to get this. And edict effects normally come down much earlier in the game anyway. 7 mana is a lot. 5/5 is not amazing for that, but Hexproof means that you can do whatever you want to this creature with impunity. Nothing's going to happen to it, and it's really hard for your opponent to interact. Blue is going to have a better chance of slamming this creature in the late game, so this does kind of give you a goal to work towards, and I would be a little hesitant to start cycling this super early in the game if my game plan was to get to it and play it. If I don't have a lot of other larger creatures and I know I'm going to have trouble closing out the game, I would kind of hold back and think about whether I wanted to cycle this on turn 1 or 2 and really wait to see if I'm going to hit my land drops and make sure I can play it. If you do play it, I think you'll be satisfied with it, although there are some times you'll play this and your opponent's still just going to run you over. It is a 7 mana creature. That's not amazing, but it cycles cheaply if you need to, and it's hard to interact with it when it does stick. Next up, a card I like a little bit more than the Sidewinder, or whatever its name was, Side Serpent. I already forgot. Anyway, Unquenchable Thirst. 1 in a blue for a common aura, enchant a creature. When Unquenchable Thirst enters the battlefield, if you control a desert or there's one in your graveyard, you can tap the enchanted creature, or you do tap the enchanted creature, and that creature does not untap during its controller's untap step. So the untap part is just going to be there no matter what. whether the creature taps or not is dependent on whether or not you have access to a desert in your graveyard or on the battlefield already. I really don't think it's hard to get deserts in draft. If you want a desert, you're probably going to be able to get one. Even if it's not an on-color desert, there are plenty of colorless deserts that some people just aren't interested in for their decks. So if you pick Unquenchable Thirst early, there's probably a good chance you'll get a desert to back it up. Without a desert, it's basically Ice Over, which is not a good card, but something you'll play some amount of the time. One thing to note here is that there are an unusually high number of untap effects because there is Exert and there are a lot of potential ways that untap effects interact with Exert creatures. So there are ways to get around Unquenchable Thirst, but I think the card will work the way you want it to vast majority of the time. And again, whether you're playing defense or whether you are that blue aggro deck, Unquenchable Thirst tapping down a creature on turn 2 or 3 when you're ready to attack seems like a pretty good tempo play in my opinion. Next up on this list, Unsummon. Solid card here. 1 blue, instant, common, return target creature to its owner's hand. So kind of an improvement over Winds of Rebuke. It only targets creatures. Remember that Winds of Rebuke could target any non-land permanent. There were some cool things you could do there. But most of the time, you're just going to hit a creature anyway. Unsummon is just cheap, efficient way of interacting with your opponent's creatures. You don't want a lot of these effects. You want 1 or 2. And the more aggressive you are, the more you are able to take advantage of the tempo swing, the better off the card will play. If you're just playing it, bounce a creature, and you don't really have a game plan, you're just trying to disrupt what your opponent's doing without doing anything yourself, I don't think that's what you want to be doing. I think you'll be disappointed in the long run. So I'm happy to have 1, maybe 2 unsummons in most of my blue decks, and I would take them higher than I would Winds of Rebuke. I think they're solid. I think they're going to play out very well, and I'm glad that blue has access to this sort of effect. Moving on to our high priority playables. These are the cards that I'm not first picking, but I'm happy to get past them second, third, fourth pick, and they're almost always going to make my deck. In fact, they probably always will make my deck. First is Sinuous Striker. Obvious comparison here to Water Courser, even though a little bit different. 2 and a blue for a 2/2 uncommon Naga Warrior. You can pay blue to give it +1/-1 until end of turn, so you can do that one time basically. Otherwise, it kills itself after this from the second activation onward. Eternalize for 3 and double blue, but you also have to discard a card to eternalize this. So it's similar to Sunscourge Champion, where you have a cheaper eternalize cost, but you also have to pitch a card, even though you can turn that to an advantage, especially in blue, where you might have excess cards from card draw, or you might have other embalm or eternalize creatures just sitting in your hand. So if you can turn that into an advantage, that's really the sweet spot. But how good is the card on its own? I think the base card is fine. It trades up with 3 toughness creatures or other creatures that your opponent's going to be playing on turn 3, since you can turn it into a 3/1 and do that fairly cheaply too. So I think it's fine as is. If this card didn't even have Eternalize, I would play it a good percentage of the time. Eternalize is just gravy on top of that, and the Eternalize version comes back as a 4/4 with the same ability, so it can activate up to 3 times, could potentially become a 7/1. Which can really smash your opponent if they're not anticipating or if they're not able to block it, something along those lines. A very solid card. Again, I'm not first picking this. This isn't like some bomb uncommon or some mythic uncommon. It's just a card that you'll play in all your blue decks. Next one after that is Supreme Will. I'll admit that I'd probably take this card a lot higher than most people. I really value flexibility, and I think this card is sweet, but it's not the type of card you first pick. It's the type of card that you're happy to pick once you are blue. It's 2 and a blue for an uncommon instant. You can choose one of the following. Either counter target spell unless its controller pays 3 mana, or look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So it's kind of like Anticipate plus Mana Leak in the same card, even though I guess it's like Impulse plus Mana Leak in the same card, since it lets you look at 4. I actually just reading that card out loud, realized that it lets you look at 4 and not 3. I assumed it was Anticipate. But anyway, Supreme Will, super solid. These two effects play together very well. Normally, card draw and counter spells, if you have one of each in your hand, are 2 cards that play very well together, because your opponent might give you the opportunity to counter something, in which case you usually take that opportunity, but sometimes they just pass the turn, sometimes they don't do anything, sometimes they play something you're not interested in countering, And then you have a failsafe. You have a backup plan of using the draw spell instead. Combining that into a single card is really, really sweet. And I think you'll be happy to play every single copy of Supreme Will you can pick up. And I think both these modes, while expensive for either mode, just combined together make for a really strong card. Next up, Aerial Guide. A lot of people saying that this might be blue's best common, and I don't know, I might agree here. Aerial Guide's 2 and a blue for a 2/2 common Drake with flying. When it attacks, another target attacking creature gains flying until end of turn. So just a really solid beater. First off, 3 mana 2/2 flyer, already a solid card. I've mentioned that before in the white review. Probably hear me say it a couple more times. Just a card you'll play as is, Windrake, essentially. And being able to jump another attacker is very good. It just lets you get over. You know, you're not really going to build a flyer deck a lot of the times in this format, but giving another creature flying is a legitimate way to close out a game. It makes it really hard for your opponent to race. It's a card that plays very, very well on the play, where you can get ahead and you can really force the issue and start attacking in the air. It gets a little bit worse on the draw. If you fall behind, you might not be able to make attacks, and this card loses a lot of its value. But I think it's just going to be a solid card altogether. And, you know, it can just close out games. It plays very, very well in blue-green, especially where you have access to super large creatures. And I consider this basically an upgrade to Zenith Seeker, which was a card that I found very, very underwhelming from Amonkhet. Moving on to our 8s, strong first picks. These are the cards that I'm looking to first pick here. And Champion of Wits is a card that I'm never passing in my first pack. 2 and a blue for a 2/1 rare Naga Wizard. When it enters the battlefield, you may draw 2 cards. That's not exactly what it says. You may draw cards equal to its power, and if you do, discard 2 cards. So when you cast this card for 3 mana, you do draw 2 cards, and then you discard 2 cards, which is a nice little filter, and you're not actually getting any sort of advantage there, but you do get to filter your hand. And if your hand's really, really solid, you don't have to use the effect in the first place, even though I recommend doing so majority of the time. Just having options is very good and limited. The Eternalize here is expensive. It's 7. It might be, I think, the most expensive Eternalized creature in the entire set. I might be wrong about that. But 5 and double blue, 7 mana total to bring it back as a 4/4, except you get that trigger again. So now you're drawing cards equal to its power and discarding 2 cards. You're drawing 4, discarding 2, and now you're actually up 2 cards. Over the course of the game, this filters 6 cards. It lets you look at 6 new cards, which can really shape a game plan. Yes, the stats are a little underwhelming for a 3-drop, but that's fine. It's a card that you're fine playing on turn 3, and hopefully it trades off with your opponent's 3/2, or even if it trades with their 2-drops, you know that it's going to get some value later in the game. This card's really, really good. I've already seen it passed a couple times, and I don't think that's something you should be doing when it comes to pack 1. I think blue is better in this format, and I think you should give Champion of Wits a second look if you're the person passing this card. Another strong pick here, Nimble Obstructionist. A lot of cards, people going crazy about this card, even though I don't think it's that good outside of limited, but hey, we're not here to talk about constructed, are we? 2 and a blue for a 3/1 rare bird wizard with flash, flying, cycling for 2 and a blue, so 3 mana cycling. And whenever you cycle it, you can counter target activated or triggered ability you don't control. It says you don't control there, so you don't have to counter your own cycling ability, I presume. Pretty funny stuff, but that would be a little annoying. Anyway, I'm ignoring that last piece of text. Yes, you can counter like Embalm, and you can counter Eternalize. You can counter, I don't know. There's some other things you can counter which might pop up, but overall, this is just such an efficient flyer that you're going to cast this. I'm not interested in cycling this card ever, and it's really interesting because cycling is supposed to be like an alternative to casting the card, right? And cycling's usually cheaper than the card, where it's a different cost than the card. But if you notice, Nimble Obstructionist costs the same amount to cycle that it does to cast. And I guarantee you, 9 times out of 10, you would rather have a 3/1 flyer than the random card you get from cycling here if it costs the same amount. Now, compare this to something like Aven Mind Sensor, which is a card you'll play already in your white decks. And Nimble Obstructionist is just that and significantly better. Yeah, Mind Sensor has that text about searching libraries, whatever, but who cares, right? 2 power flyer for 3 mana with flash is a good card. So obviously 3 power flyer for the same mana cost, still with flash and flying, is a very good card. And, Cyclone's upside. I don't think you're going to be countering activated and triggered abilities. Like, I don't know. How many times did you counter a triggered ability with disallow? Like, in limited. It just doesn't come up that often, even though, it's there. You can do it. I guess you can counter Cyclone if you're a real jerk, but you'll cast this card. It beats very, very hard. It's a very strong card, and I'm happy to first pick. Another 8 here, very similar vein. Ominous Sphinx, 3 and double blue for a 4/4 uncommon Sphinx with flying. Whenever you cycle or discard a card, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-0 until end of turn. So obviously this fits really well in a Cyclone-based deck, but it's just solid on its own. With no extra ability, a 4-power flyer for 5 mana is already a good card, and it blocks pretty decently too. And then if you get to untap with it and you have access to any Cyclone in your hand, your opponent basically just can't attack you anymore because you can threaten to activate this whenever you feel like it, and it just takes down your opponent's creatures in combat and makes them almost irrelevant. I think there are a lot of times that games will be decided by Ominous Sphinx, and even if you don't have any cyclers in your hand, your opponent kind of has to sit back and think about what you could do if you would have them in your hand, and it makes it very awkward for them. It's a miserable card to play against. It's kind of like a super beefy, pumped up version of Pitiless Vizier, the one that gets indestructible when you cycle, except much, much worse for your opponent because it basically affects how all of combat will go. It can really swing a combat for your other creatures too. But I don't know. Even on its own, it's so good that you'll just play it all the time anyway, and you'll be happy about it with the cycle and trigger basically being just extra gravy on top of that. All right, moving into our nines. We have 2 nines here, and we're going to wrap up after that. Sorry, guys, still no tens. Still no tens, but I will justify that by the end of my series. The first 9 I want to talk about is Unesh, Cryosphinx Sovereign. What a mouthful. 4 and double blue for a 4/4 and mythic rare legendary Sphinx creature. At first, I didn't realize this was mythic. It seems more like just a regular rare, but whatever. It says, here's the fun part. Sphinx spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. If that's ever relevant for you, you probably already won the draft. So I don't know. If you have that many sphinges in your deck, yes, the plural of sphinx is sphinges, then, congratulations, you open bombs. But anyway, whenever Unesh, Cryosphinx Sovereign, or another Sphinx enters the battlefield under your control, you reveal the top 4 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles, and you choose a pile to put in your hand, and you put the other pile into the graveyard. So every time you play a Sphinx, including when Unesh enters the battlefield, you get this mini factor fiction-like ability. 4 cards instead of 5, but you always get the card that you really want out of the pile. Even if your opponent separates it 1 and 3, then you just get the best card out of that pile for free on top of the 4/4 flyer you're already getting, or you just draw 3 cards. On average, you're probably going to get 2 cards out of this, which is a fine deal. It makes it a super powerful Mold Drifter. I would play 6 mana, 4/4 flyers already, especially in blue where I can back them up or where that's a legitimate win condition. But when those draw me cards, I think that's a legitimate threat. Again, I'm not going to give this a 10. I do think it's a solid card. I think I'll play it almost every single time I'm in blue. In fact, I will play it in blue, even though, I don't know, I see some other rares I would take over this. But but it doesn't protect itself, so there's that. It does die to, common removal spells, electrify, stuff like that, puncture and blow. So it is vulnerable. It's, as far as power level goes, minus the draw ability, it's on par with some uncommons in this set, but the extra draw on top of it really pushes it into bomb status for me. And our final card for today, I actually do consider this the best blue card in the set. It's just a tried and true formula, and while it does come with a downside, I think it's super justified here. Kefnet's Last Word is my vote for strongest blue card in the set, mono blue at least. 2 and double blue for a rare sorcery that says gain control of target artifact, creature, or enchantment. Lands you control don't untap during your next untap step. So like a much, much cheaper version of Lay Claim. But the cool part is that it's not an enchantment. It's not an aura like Lay Claim. So your opponent can't destroy the aura or blanket or something like that and get their creature back. It's just permanent mind control on your opponent's best card. It can take artifacts, it can take enchantments. There are some pretty bonkers enchantments in this set. And as long as you're not, dumb enough to take a curse that your opponent's cursed you with, you should get something good out of this. It's a 2-for-1. These cards like mind control and stuff like that, confiscation coup from Kaladesh, they always play very well. And yes, this has a downside attached to it, and it's a legit downside. Don't neglect to remember that it does that. Lanes you control don't untap during your next untap step. That's a legitimate problem, but this is a 2-for-1 already, and you should be able to stabilize the board enough, or at least take control of the board where you can afford to take that turn off. I say it's a 2-for-1 because your opponent loses a card and you gain a card, and that's just how these mind control effects work. They're built in 2-for-1s, and they always play very nicely. I think 4 mana is really sweet for this effect. You usually don't see this at 4 mana unless it's in the form of some really risky enchantment or if there's some drawback attached to it. And yes, there's a drawback here, but I'm always taking Kefnet's Last Word. It's a nice little out to some of the cards in the set that you otherwise might not be able to take care of. Things like Sandworm Convergence and, I don't know, some busted enchantment or some really powerful creature. Just imagine taking your opponent's god with this and just wrecking them with their own god. It seems insane. But anyway, that's my vote for strongest blue a brick card in the set, and I think it's enough better than all of the other blue cards that I would be happy to first pick it over the rest of them if I wanted to play blue. Now, with that being said, remember that blue wasn't very good in Amonkhet. I think it was a clear worst color. You can argue with me on that if you want, but I agree. And while blue decks were viable, they weren't terrible, like so bad that you just wouldn't play them. I think they've gotten a good upgrade here. Cards like Unsummon are pretty important. Unquenchable Thirst is a decent removal spell. And you've got some really good late game enders with your flyers, as you usually do. But having some uncommon payoff cards is really nice. Not to mention you have a lot of card filtering too, and some late game inevitability with your Eternalized creatures. So I think blue's looking a little bit up here, and I'm not sure if the blue aggro deck's going to pan out, but we'll see, right? Next up, we're going to go ahead and cover some black cards, and there's some really interesting ones for that video. But until then, thanks for watching. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to. And my name's Timothy, and I'll see you guys next time.